Thank you for joining us on another episode of Latter-day Stories podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashworth. An exciting episode today. We are going to cover a lot of territory. We were planning this podcast episode to discuss suicide prevention with Jody Hansen and what she's doing with the QPR program, the Question, Persuade, and Refer program within the state of Utah among stakes, wards, branches, and generally within the community through programs like the Gay Straight Alliance and in conjunction with programs through the state legislature and other coalitions. We also were informed and made aware of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints rescission of the November 2015 Policy of Exclusion. So today's episode, we're going to tackle both of those topics, and in a very real and realistic sense, they are very much entwined, and especially within the LGBT community, they are connected. So grateful to have you a part of this episode, and thank you for supporting the Latter-day Stories podcast. The Latter-day Stories podcast is made possible through generous donors, through viewers and listeners just like you. If you support the mission of the Latter-day Stories podcast and want to financially help us bring more stories just like this one to the community, we invite you to make a donation. You can donate in two easy ways. First, by visiting our website at latterdaystories.org and clicking on the donate button. Or you can send us a text directly to 77948. You can text the word stories to 77948 and make a donation that way. Excited again to be welcomed into Jody Hansen's home to talk about this very near and dear topic. Jody, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be talking about this.
We are really excited. A little bit of kind of a change of pace in the Latter-day Stories podcast lineup, where we typically discuss stories about LGBT or queer stories as they directly impact a family. But as you and I were discussing this topic, there's not a greater opportunity to discuss queer topics without hand in hand acknowledging that there's a suicide epidemic in the state of Utah and a very real and large suicide epidemic within the LGBT community.
Yes.
So again, thank you for opening your home and allowing us here to discuss a really hard and often difficult topic.
Yes, it is. And it's true that it really does impact all of us. I know a lot of the stories lately have been about the epidemic in Utah. I wish I could say it's the only place that it's happening. It's not. It really is happening everywhere. And of course, this is my state, my community. I've returned here a few years ago, but it has been a concern for many years. And the fact that it's gained such attention is getting more people involved and willing to do things. And in my efforts with a variety of groups and a variety of people, we're seeing what we can do to learn and grow and hopefully have an impact.
So for those who aren't familiar with who Jody is, you're very well connected in the queer community and also on a state level with a lot of legislation and things that are going on. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Why the tie to the LGBT community? Why the advocacy? And maybe a little bit about Jody.
Love to. I am an active LDS person who was fortunate enough to be raised in a very nuanced LDS home where questions were not only encouraged, they were expected. Seeking and learning all aspects of history and community and the wonderful things as well as the messy parts of the church, our history, leadership, changes, our involvement in making things happen as members and as leaders, our responsibility to have a say in how our community focused. That was very much the type of home that I grew up in. And also, I grew up in an activist home that linked advocacy and activism to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That if we were truly going to acknowledge the difference Christ made in the world, it would be acknowledging our need to look and see where there was a need and our part in making something happen according to holding one another up and mourning with each other and standing for those who were marginalized or being hurt or in need. And so that was always very much tied up with church community and learning about the gospel and how it played out in my life. And from the time I was 8, my dad was taking me and my siblings with them to pass out flyers for issues. And we lived in the Bay Area. My dad taught at Stanford. He was a founding editor of Dialogue, and so there were a lot of conversations that intersected thought and study and activism. And this was the civil rights era, and I've been a feminist since I was a kid, and that was very much a part of my Mormonism. And so openly gay relatives from, that I was aware of in our home from the 80s on. And I made the mistake of thinking I was very enlightened. And then when my own child came out, I have a queer child who has made a request that I not talk about specifics for his story, but just to say that when my own child came out over 10 years ago, it really bumped me out of thinking I was enlightened into realizing I was woefully ignorant and had a lot to learn. And so since that time, it's become a much more personal issue for me to recognize that it's more than a concept to be an advocate. It's much more than just learning to be an ally. It's being willing to be confronted. It's being willing to always listen more than what you thought you were listening to.
It's a great point, because in all of these spaces, there are places for allies, there are places for change, and there are places for better understanding. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate what you say about you think you know a lot until the sill of living reality hits, and you are directly impacted by this topic.
Yes.
And it's interesting that as we journey down this path, especially through the streets of LGBT Street and LDS Avenue and the very real intersections that we come to, when you know someone who is directly impacted by this topic, your world changes.
Yeah.
And things become very more real. And we're seeing that. Maybe this is a great segue into what's happening currently in the discussion about the church's the rescinding of the November 2015 policy.
Yes.
That's a very real topic that affects our families. Mm-hmm. It affects our congregations, and in terms of suicide prevention, it affects real people. There are bodies associated with this November 2015 policy. Let's talk a little bit about that. Where do we go from here?
Well, part of it is to be where we're at right now. And so today, the announcement was this morning. I saw it literally like the second it was posted by the newsroom. And one reason I did is I was on my way to, I'm a part of the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition. I'm on the Coalition for Salt Lake City, and then also on the LGBTQ work group for the state coalition. And our focus obviously is suicide prevention. I lead QPR suicide prevention training. Lately, for many GSA, Gay Straight Alliance groups for high schools, there's a QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. It's a nationally recognized best practices means of getting everyone involved in suicide prevention, awareness and prevention. And then also this intersectionality. Many people assume that being aware or becoming an ally for the LGBTQ community is not something they need to be concerned about. And it's hard to bring them into a conversation where they're being willing to learn more and examine their own paradigm. But something that everyone that I have encountered, people who were totally shut off in talking about the importance of inclusion, I bring up suicide prevention, and they are sitting up, they are paying attention because they have been impacted. And so the suicide prevention conversation has really brought a lot of people inevitably into the conversation about LGBTQ inclusiveness. So I personally feel it is impossible to be involved in one and not somehow confront yourself in the other. And so I had parked the car, and an interesting thing, I work as an ordinance worker at the Salt Lake Temple on Thursday mornings, and I had a moment in the Celestial Room this morning, and I literally was praying that leaders would be, as I always do, I think we all need to speak up. We all need to pray and address everything that we know about a loving and inclusive God. And I don't believe in a micromanaging God. I don't believe God forces anyone to feel a certain way. And yet I do think God sits with us. I think they are there, feeling with us, mourning with us, hurting with us, and so much enticing us to be led towards radically inclusive love. But I was praying, as I usually do, that hearts could be open, specifically of our leaders as General Conference is coming up, as I'm encouraging people, look, if you feel triggered, don't watch it. We need to learn how to look for the messages of love and set the rest aside, and that is not an easy thing to do. So I had hurried from that shift to this meeting, this suicide prevention meeting. I see these texts about the announcement on Newsroom, and I am weeping. I cannot tell you how many times I've spoken with church leaders and thanked them for efforts on the Mormon and Gay website or suicide prevention or having messages of inclusion. And at the same time, I say all of this is overshadowed by this policy. This will never have the impact it could as long as that policy is in place. And so many of us have tried to convey that in many different ways. And I would like to think that that is part of it, that people speaking up and being heard. And so this is an important thing, because everything about the policy goes against the core of what we're about. It goes against every article of faith. It goes against the gospel of Christ. And so to me, it was inevitable that it had to be rescinded, or we would stop being who we say we are. But I was hurrying into this meeting and running and shouting and grabbing the other people on this coalition who had been looking forward to this and wanting this, and at the same time we were weeping in mourning. The losses are great. I visited the grave of a dear friend who died of suicide last year. Nothing will bring her back. And I get that she would be glad that this is gone, in a sense. But I think she would also be doing all she could to help people deal with the pain. There was not an apology. There was not an acknowledgement. I think there was an attempt. To me, I read the statement. I think I see a lot of different efforts coming in, trying to find consensus in how this was said. I can see how there was going back and forth. Some people saying, you need to say this, and others saying, well, we can't go that far. So I think there was a lot of input on that. When I read this, and I've read it several times, this statement, and it's just a reminder, this is a community of people who are doing the best they can with what they have, and sometimes it causes a lot of despair, and we need to sit with that.
So let's discuss the two communities that are impacted most by this, the LGBT community and the active LDS community. Where does the LDS community go forward? Where do they go from here?
I would hope that we who are active LDS will do all we can to see that there is no resource more important than each of us in how we treat each other and how we seek to hear directly from God how we can be more loving and inclusive no matter who we are, no matter our differences. I would like the members who stay engaged to recognize, yes, we value leadership, we value those who are in callings of leadership that are, for the most part, administration, and that there are times when they do speak with inspiration, and get that we are each responsible to recognize, to seek guidance as to know when something is testifying of a loving God and when something isn't, and be responsible for our actions around that. And I think that should always be how we can go forward. Always be open.
You're saying we need to focus a greater emphasis on personal revelation, what that Spirit is personally testifying to you, as opposed to a general consensus as to what the body of the leadership is teaching.
Or just assuming that because someone says that's automatically a totally unfiltered direct line to what God would say. From the first days of the church, we've had leaders warning us, don't assume that I, as the head of the church, am not biased. Don't assume that I don't struggle with things. Every leader has said that in some form or another, sometimes repeatedly. And we need to remember that, because often we want to just make someone else responsible for how we think and how we feel. We need to realize we are here to learn and grow and gain our own recognition of what is God-like, what truly is Christ-like. And I think Christ was a great example. It's time after time. Look, ultimately, it's love one another. Everything hangs on this. And to me, that means if there is anything that contradicts how we learn to love one another, if there is anything that encourages us to build barriers rather than to create connection, we need to set that aside. Christ reminded us time and again, yes, there are laws, yes, there are communities, yes, there are promises and covenants we make, and when you're wondering, you always go for loving someone, for caring for them, for treating them as though they were God. No matter who it is, even if it's the worst, most unclean outcast, the ultimate thing is you see them as God. And I think when we are quick to give up our own ability and responsibility to be guided to that, we tend to fail to connect directly with God. And I'm not saying that it's an either-or thing. I think it's something that we as a community, as individual members and as a community, can encourage in each other and in our entire community. We can recognize, oh yeah, I get that. And that kind of is building a barrier that might be coming from bias, which we're all subject to. And I think we're all doing the best we can with what we have. I choose to believe that about every person. I fail at that frequently, recognizing that. I get furious. I see the impact, and I sit with a lot of people in pain, just as God sits with me when I'm in pain. That's where I learn it. And when I see people saying words that cause others to despair, it's hard for me to remember. They are coming from a different place. They have different experience. I cannot assume that they are being malicious or intentionally doing that. I need to see everyone as doing the best they can, because that's what I'm doing, even though I fail.
Do you think that's where a bridge could be built between the LDS and LGBT community? This very real concept of being furious? Because I think I can acknowledge that exists in the LGBT community in regards to things like the November 2015 policy, where that infuriated families. And it was I've heard it called a slap in the face, a rejection of reality. And I'm not discounting the very negative and difficult impacts of the 2015 policy. But is there a responsibility for the LGBT community to also be open and more willing to acknowledge exactly what you just spoke about, the place where the LDS community is at?
I am not going to say it is the responsibility of the LGBT community to do any concessions. That is not my place. Absolutely not. It just isn't. Any more than I would say anyone should feel fine about returning to activity in the church because of this rescinding. That is not my place. Just like it's not anyone's place, including those who are active in the church. I've had leaders in the church, local leaders, tell me that I should not be a part of the community because of my advocacy. I don't give them the right to tell me where I belong in the community where I feel led. And I am really not going to, I really, really do not think it's my place to tell anyone else anything along that line. I'm not going to tell anyone how to feel about this. And again, before we can move forward, we've got to sit with what's so. And so this is not only impactful to the LGBTQ community and those who are active in the church, it's difficult for those who have left the church. This is tough. This is bringing a lot of stuff up.
It absolutely is. I think,
and I'm not going to tell anyone they shouldn't be feeling the way they're feeling.
And we've discussed this earlier about those who are directly impacted through excommunication. What position is the church in it today? Do they un-excommunicate people who are no longer deemed apostate?
Well, and this covers a lot of other areas, but I personally think excommunication is barbaric and should be done away with. I think a lot more than this, these excommunications need to be rescinded. I think it's a harmful practice. I can understand why there might need to be excommunications over physically harmful and criminal behavior, but to excommunicate over a different way of looking at something, especially a legal action, I think is harmful. And I think the entire rhetoric around worthiness needs a complete deconstruction. And so, yes, I think it should be an automatic. If someone chooses to have their excommunication overturned, if that is their desire, I think it should just be automatic with this. Because in the first place, it was just so much about the worthiness rhetoric, and anytime someone is considered an apostate over a difference of how something is viewed, very harmful to the church as a body.
And I think the point that you brought up, under a legal, not illegal, a legal action.
Yeah.
Where marriage is legal.
People are legally married.
Yes. And further, they're living the law of chastity.
Right.
They are legally and lawfully wed. They attend church actively. There are bishops who want to give them callings, but are not able to. And then further, the violation of the first article of faith, allowing children to be punished for the sins of Adam, which was always very confusing to me. Let's, there's so much. In the next few weeks and months, this will unfold. I don't know how it unfolds.
Well, even at the time that the policy was leaked, it was so violent. It was so severe and violent. And again, we need to be willing to sit with the pain, because this, as important as it is that this had to happen, and it had to happen, from the moment this was leaked, it is clear that it had to be rescinded. It is so obviously contradictory to everything that is so central to the gospel. People can say that the doctrine of the family is central to the gospel. They can call all kinds of things central to the gospel. But in my mind, and I get this is my interpretation, things such as the beauty and the mysticism of the 13 articles of faith, that's central to the gospel. That draws me so much to what the restoration is about. Nowhere does it mention what a family's supposed to look like. Nowhere does it mention gender roles. It applies universally, and the gospel was restored because of a desire for a universal community of salvation. And so with something that is so contradictory to that, for whatever reason, whatever well-meaning intent someone might feel was behind this, it was inevitable this had to end, or the church could no longer be connected with its roots. So it had to happen. It's just the longer it went without happening, the more trauma is going to be connected with this, because the more bodies in the wake.
Are you surprised it happened 3.5 years after its announcement?
There have been a number of times when I thought we had reliable information saying it would end sooner. So I don't know. I don't know if surprise is the thing. I didn't know exactly. I had come to start wondering, how is this going to happen? Because no matter what, there had to be concern that it happened without an image problem. Well, I'm sorry, there's no way for anything about this to move forward without having an image problem. And inevitably, we need to start as a community be thinking, is pastoral care more important than the image? At some point, pastoral care has to be more important. And we'll deal with the image. We'll deal with we'll deal with all of the assumptions and the reasonings. But if we follow treating each other as we promised to at baptism, to come together in community and to bear one another up and really care for one another, is because we are all the poor and needy. All of us are bereft. The other stuff becomes less of this big burden we're carrying. And so, yeah, I get, it's so much a part of legal conversations and everything, but really, are we going to be more concerned about legal conversations, or are we concerned about pastoral care?
And I think the church has a history of taking a very long time to correct those issues. They also have a history of recuperating. 1891 in the polygamy, 1978 blacks in the priesthood, 2019, I don't know what we're going to call this one, the Policy of Exclusion times, and many other bouts through church history.
I call it the death cycle of the exclusion policy, because I can't think of anything else.
That's it. And so the church has experience in recuperating a PR image. So I'm agreeing with you. I think it is a pastoral issue. And along that lines, I have an interesting experience. I don't know if it fits, but I was speaking to an emeritus general authority who happened to be involved in some of the personal apologies made to some stakes in California after the Prop 8. And he had mentioned in a presentation that he had hopes for a more transparent church history being conveyed when he saw that the church had officially supported and provided access for the publication of a book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, a very, warts and all history of that. And he said, when I saw that the church was lending resources and support to publish a book on the worst event in our history, then I had hope that there was more transparent work going on. And I spoke with him personally after, and I said, I really appreciate that. And in my mind, the worst event in our history was November 2015. We have more deaths because of it. The church, I think, is much more damaged as a community because of it. But we don't have the luxury of kind of brushing it under the rug for a long time. We don't have the luxury of thinking, oh, this will just, we can just keep this away from
attention. It was everywhere from the moment it happened. And I think it might do more damage than anything else. Do you think we can recover? And all he said was, I agree with you. I think that is the worst event in our history. And he says, I don't know.
What do we do? How do we, I mean, it is difficult for us to create a recovery plan, but today and yesterday, let's talk about what you're doing to mitigate that damage.
As I think, I really like a recent blog that Ben Schilotti wrote called "We Are the Resources," and this, I was talking with him about this. I think we need to stop waiting to be told how to be Christ-like. I think that's within all of us.
And a little background on, just because I think that's a very important point. Ben wrote this blog post based on a stake president and bishop meeting that he was asked to speak in, and it was a question and answer scenario where some of the bishops and stake presidents who were very favorable to the LGBT community were saying, where are the resources for us to take this message and put the LDS stamp on it, to take back to our words and to say this is commissioned or this is from the leadership. Where are those resources?
It's interesting because while he was leading that, I was leading a QPR suicide prevention in another room. And he hurried over right after this to tell me about it. But he says it was like this moment of pure inspiration to say, you are the resources. Each of us is the best resource the church has.
The members of the church.
The members of the church. Every single member of the church. There is no better resource to be the people we say we are than each of us. And yes, I understand. We're human. We love to be told what to do. And then we know that if it doesn't work out, we can blame someone else for it. It's like Adam and Eve in the garden. This is why this is our great symbolic ritual. This metaphor of being in the garden, and Adam and Eve there is Adam and Eve in all of us. This is not a gender role thing. This is a human thing. And Adam is the part of us that wants to, that just knows if I just do what I'm told and don't worry about stepping out of line, everything's going to be fine and nothing else. And the Eve part of us is just going, yes, but there's something, there's wisdom. And it's going to require stepping into the unknown. And it might hurt. And I don't know how it's going to look, but this is where the essential part of me is drawn. And it takes this cooperation between these disparate parts of us to come together and work together before we can move towards divinity and really experience God. But the moment something doesn't work out, what happens? God is saying, you did this. And Adam is pointing his finger and saying, no, it's her fault. And she's pointing her finger and saying, no, it's the serpent's fault. It's the allegory of our life. We want to point a finger, and we want to know that we're not the ones who made things happen and made things go south. And we got to be willing to say, okay, well, whoever's fault it is, whether it's mine or someone else's, I'm the resource. I'm the resource that's going to bring this true, deep, gut-wrenching, but incredible love into the conversation. And that will presence God. And it's ultimately what draws us forward and instead of staying stuck in the same old destructive conversation of going nowhere. It may be a pretty garden, but we're going nowhere.
Take us somewhere. How do we address this epidemic of suicide in the state of Utah?
One of the most important aspects of suicide prevention is we have to be willing to sit with each other in our pain. I will encourage everyone to have one of us who is certified to lead QPR, and I lead it for stakes, I lead it for wards, I lead it for school groups, I lead it for, at the Pride Center, at the AIDS Foundation. I've been all over the place leading this. This is a best practices training that is geared for everybody. And it is the only, and here's something that I need to acknowledge. The First Presidency sent a letter out, and QPR is the training that they are recommending that every bishop and stake president have their wards do. It's, and I really appreciate that. It has opened, again, the opportunity. But in this really great training, the thing that I emphasize the most, well, there are several main points, but the most effective thing we can do is sit with each other and listen. Get that no matter who you are, no matter what your life looks like, no matter what you assume about someone, everyone is carrying great pain, a lot of burdens. And there's something that I do in the midst of the presentation to just show what practicing connection can do. It's overwhelming. And it breaks down barriers. And so if we can learn how to step through our discomfort where we don't even want to look each other in the eye and just be with each other and just be there and say, I know that because you're here, you care about great love in this world. You want to make great things happen. And I also know that because you're here, you've experienced deep pain, sometimes overwhelming. Sometimes there are times when you just don't know how you're going to make it through the day. Thank you for being here. I love you. And it doesn't require agreement or knowing details or anything at all. But there's this moment where someone is feeling connected and their burdens are lightened. And we've got to be willing to step through this. Well, I got to make sure they look like me or feel like me or dress like me or agree with me or think the same way about what is true and what's not true. And we're so caught up in that, we're literally leaving bodies in our wake. So there are a few things more powerful for suicide prevention than just sitting with each other, being the people we say we want to be. When we raised our hands and shouted for joy at the thought that we could bear one another's burdens.
So are your classes geared only for people who are at risk?
No. These are geared for everybody. Everybody. It's a means of teaching that absolutely everybody can be aware of what is a sign of suicidal thoughts and how to listen, how to talk, and how to get people to help. And so it really is geared to everybody. It's based on CPR training, how CPR training was developed so that anyone who's walking down the street, if someone all of a sudden clutches their chest and falls over, they recognize the signs of a heart attack or some problem, and they can administer care until that person can be taken to someone who's a professional. QPR is based on the same thing. Question, and the question refers to learning how to listen and know when to ask, are you thinking about suicide? Are you in deep pain? Question and then persuade it is more along the lines of sit with them so that they can be persuaded that they're not alone.
Feeling of empathy.
Yeah. And then refer them to professional help, understand at what point they might need that, and understand how to do something that could help them take that step instead of a step that it's really based around seeing that suicide is not a very narrow focus thing. It is very, there are so many reasons. There are so many aspects that can cause someone to feel pain so great that they will do anything to end that pain. It's not about ending your life, it's about ending pain. And that's what people who are thinking of suicide, they're struggling with. We're made to keep breathing, but we're made to avoid pain. And when pain is so intense, the only option we see is to no longer be alive. We want to help people see that there might be other options. What I see happening is people contacting me and saying, I was able to ask. I saw that my child, my spouse, my colleague, my friend was hurting, and I was able to ask. And he, she, they're getting care. They're seeing a therapist. They're in the hospital. I'm so glad I was there. I wouldn't have thought that I could call the hotline. I thought I had to get someone else to call the hotline. I have people messaging me and just saying, help me breathe. And they won't talk to me, but they'll message me. And I will keep messaging them. And I've learned how to message someone and say, okay, breathe in, 1, 2, 3, and I'm typing this out, and I'm saying, are you breathing out? Would you count with me? Okay, is anyone with you? And while we're breathing, I'm talking with them. And it used to be that I would just shut down. I wouldn't know what to do. But that's the point. If we're willing to open up and see any of us can do something, then it could make a difference. So that's kind of generalizing a lot of the things that I've heard personally from this. But I think I think at the very least, well, not at the very least, there are a lot of good things that are happening. But one of the things that I appreciate is this conversation has people, like my stake is hosting an event where I'm leading QPR for the stake and the community around. People who had not looked at how this overlaps with marginalizing conversations, and why it would impact people that they wouldn't think of. So for instance, one of the things that's been found is any kind of conversation that is marginalizing for any group. For instance, if a young person hears parents or leaders or teachers or government say things that suggest God cannot love someone who's LGBTQ as much, cannot value them because they are inherently not in line with God's law, that young person, even if they are not LGBTQ, is going to feel a deeper despair because they will look for ways that they themselves somehow don't measure up. It's a tendency of young people. They are looking for how they can't do it, how they're getting it wrong. And so any kind of marginalizing conversation has an impact on everybody, especially on youth. And so when this is part of the QPR training is to recognize and identify when you think you might just be, talking about what you've always thought was true or right about how the law works, how civilization works, how, what scriptures mean or everything. Recognize, that is a message that could be piercing someone right through their heart and causing hopelessness that could lead to them not wanting to breathe anymore. And so I think it's really important that we recognize all of us can be open to learning. Where have I blown it? Am I willing to see that, say I'm sorry, and be willing to learn and shift how I say things and what I do if it could mean that someone else wants to keep living.
How do we connect with your QPR program or find out where you're teaching next?
Well, I'll make sure that my email is up, and I am willing, but I am connected with the Suicide Prevention Coalition. We have a number of us who are certified to lead QPR. Deborah Oaks-Coe and I have worked on developing an intro to the official training that is focused on for LDS groups, where we've taken statements from the church website that address suicide ideation and the shifting statements and attitudes, the importance of not seeing it the way we used to see it, changing the conversation about seeing it as a sin, but rather seeing it as this is all of us, and what can we do to be Christ-like. So we really appreciate a lot of official resources that many people don't know about, and we're trying to get that out there. So for LDS audiences, I do recommend that you look at having us come and lead QPR. There are a number of us who are certified to do that. So anyone who emails me, but the QPR Institute is the name of the website. There's a great effort here in Utah to have this go everywhere. We are teaching in libraries and at the police station. We train police forces, and we have this huge effort to go around and lead it for the Gay Straight Alliance groups in high schools. I just did one yesterday, and those kids are off the charts amazing. They're just incredible. And they are really stretching themselves to be there for each other. And I think it's a great example for adults. So just email me, and I will get you in touch wherever you are. I've heard from someone up in Wyoming, and if we can't find someone up there, we'll drive up there and lead this. We're working with someone in the Portland area and down in Arizona to make sure they have people leading groups down there.
And I'm aware Nathan Kitchen, the president of Affirmation, is teaching the QPR program, and that's coming up at the All Conference, and he continues to do that as well.
Yes.
And so that reach is expanding, especially through the Affirmation community, and then as well through the LDS community.
Yeah. Well, the church
directly.
gave a grant to Affirmation specifically.
Correct.
For this.
They gave a $25,000 grant to Affirmation for the support of the QPR program. Mm-hmm. So this is on the church's radar. This is acknowledged by them as a practice that is beneficial and necessary among the members.
Yes. Yeah. So Affirmation is having these trainings at their conference. A lot of conferences are looking at having it regularly. The Pride Center is going to schedule them regularly. I just spoke with someone at the coalition meeting today, and they're starting a family resource center up there in Heber, and they're going to have a regular QPR. This is really an important thing.
We had a member of the LGBT community reached out to me a few weeks ago, and just in conversation brought up the fact that she was in a QPR training she worked for an auto dealer down in Provo at Brent Brown, an auto dealership, and in that meeting, that QPR program was taught at a staff meeting.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very dynamic opportunity to teach a lesson. But for Brent Brown and his employees, it was a good opportunity to tackle a really tough but prevalent discussion. And the leader of that QPR had mentioned that 1 in 15 people have regular suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide.
Yes.
And there were about 40 people in that room. So it was easy to say 1, 2, 3, 4 to 15, and then you've got 1, 2, nearly 3 people in this group that were impacted by this topic directly.
And this is one of the things, in fact, I acknowledged my mother the other day. Years ago, she was in charge of arranging the stake events, whether they be music programs or firesides or speakers. And she, from the time I was quite young, we have been involved in suicide prevention. So grateful for much more information than we had 50 years ago. But she really was trying to get people that she knew who were connected to national best practices to come and present on suicide prevention, and people fought her tooth and nail. They did not want it brought up. They just said, no, we can't talk about this. If we talk about it, someone's going to do it. And, so a lot of ignorance. And that was 20 some years ago that she was trying to do that. But she did not give up, kept trying, and they finally had one. It wasn't as big an event as they wanted, but some people came, and you have to believe it made some difference. And I called her up the other day when my stake president requested that we schedule this. It took a lot of conversations to make it a stake event. I had presented in Elders Quorum and Relief Society and everything, and then it was a request to do it for the stake. And I just said, Mom, thank you. You didn't give up. And that's an example to me, and I think we need to be that for each other. The message that we just don't give up on each other. It's not easy to sit with discomfort. It's not easy, but guess what? People are in pain. People are in deep pain. And so especially when people are willing to say, what? Tell me some information. I go in, yes, one in 15. And you take a group of people who are LGBTQ, that goes way up.
30%.
And then you look at groups within LGBTQ. Transgender women of color. It's off the charts. And so in a ward community, I say, okay, here's the percentage of people in the ward who are LGBTQ, whether you know it or not. That's this many people. And then the chances that any of them are thinking of or will attempt suicide, there's this. How long do you want to wait before you address this? And people, no matter how much you disagree, people don't want people to die. So it gets some conversations going.
I'm thankful for what you're doing for the community. And not just the community that pays attention to the Latter-day Stories, but the community as a whole, the LDS community within stakes, wards, branches, the general population. This is the topic that impacts us directly. This isn't just a sexuality topic. It isn't a orientation topic. This is a human issue.
Very much.
And I appreciate what you're doing to combat that and to help every one of us.
Thank you. I'm hoping that it can open up a willingness to see that just like there are as many different ways to be a Mormon as there are Mormons, there are as many different genders as there are people. To be, how ludicrous is it to think there's only two kinds of gender and each one is assigned certain roles? It just totally goes against what God is. And that there are as many ways of being human as there are people too. And if we can have room for everyone being on their own path and that we can really hold each other up on our individual paths instead of insisting, not until you're over here on mine. I think we can go a long way to helping people want to stay alive.
Great. Just for those who are listening to this podcast on an audio version through one of the podcast players, why don't you give us your email?
Yes.
And then for our Facebook, YouTube, and those who are watching the video version, we will tag you in the post as well and put your contact information. But what is your email?
So it's Hansen, Hansen, _ home, HOME, at Comcast.net. And, just email me with any concern about that, and we will do all we can to help you connect with the resources that will make a difference. Many of us who do this work, we compile resource lists for individual situations, especially for people who are LDS and are trying to shift a conversation and awareness and education. We have resource lists of official statements and the websites that the church has, and articles and a lot of things that are affirming for those who who really do need an official church stamp on it. We've got those. There are a lot more than people expect. And for those who are trying to educate their legislators or their school board or something, we are compiling a lot of resources that can help shift, but ultimately it comes down to how we treat each other. There really is no better resource than each of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kyle.
I'm excited for the progress and to see the fruits of your efforts continue to help those around us. I know it is making a direct impact. I
really hope that. I have to believe it. And like I said, in every conversation that we have an opportunity to have, to just be willing to say, thank you for doing this, and please be aware that this is causing pain. I have to believe that those messages at some point get heard.
And if you're listening to the podcast or watching it on one of the channels and have a question directly for Jody, let's add it to the bottom of where you're watching this episode. And will you be willing to respond to those questions?
In whatever way I can. I'm actually going to lead QPR soon, so there will be breaks. But yes, I will do what I can.
A good opportunity to ask questions about the program, maybe even telltale signs or just general questions about the suicidal ideation or what to look for. A part of that question,
persuade, refer.
and refer. So if you are watching on our Facebook channel or through YouTube, we invite you to put those questions below, and Jody will be happy to respond to you that way. And as well, if you are on our Facebook channel, I will tag Jody's contact information there, and you can directly link through her Facebook Messenger.
Yes.
And because we're all great at that, right?
Well, if you're specific, then I know that you're not just a troll, and I will respond.
Great. Again, Jody, thank you. Thank you for inviting us into your home and taking a few minutes to discuss this topic. The Latter-Gay Stories podcast is a good opportunity. This is a discussion that we've had today is a good opportunity for our guests and our listeners of the podcast to maybe step outside of our normal way of thinking and approach a topic that has been difficult to address but necessary among the LDS and LGBT community, and that is the skyrocketing numbers of teen suicides within the state, especially within the LGBT community. Again, we thank you for following on this episode. If you are listening to us on a podcast app through Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or another, we invite you to subscribe to this channel so as we produce new episodes, you're alerted. We also would appreciate you rating this podcast episode. By rating and sharing this podcast, we are able to climb a little higher in the ratings and provide episodes like this to a broader and more general community. And again, if you are watching the video versions of this podcast on our Facebook channel or through our YouTube page, we also invite you to subscribe and like there as well. And we are constantly having an open and real-time conversation on our Facebook page at Latter-Gay Stories. Simple to find, just facebook.com/Latter-Gay Stories. Again, thank you, Jody, for providing this sensitive and exciting topic as we address suicide and suicide prevention, which gives us the opportunity to move forward in our way of understanding this topic. And it also allows us to continue writing our Latter-Gay Stories.